Some different genres. Well, just epistles, really, haven't we? There's a lot more. So I'm gonna ask you guys to get in a plane with me, and we're gonna fly over these states. We're gonna look down and go, look, there's Kansas. We're not gonna be able to actually go into the wheat fields of Kansas and touch the wheat, but we're gonna fly over these books. After lunch, the men will get to actually exegete the book of Ruth, while the women talk about different hard passages in the Bible regarding to the roles of women. But for now, we're going to jump into Old Testament narrative. Old Testament narrative. All I'm going to do here is let you know about some possible swamps and pitfalls along the way that can be tough. Like always, content and context is what we're doing. What is a narrative? Can anybody explain what a narrative is? It's a story. Narratives are stories. You guys all know stories. Every story, every great movie. Let's see here. Kat, what's your favorite movie? You have one?
Yeah. I'm trying to think. I like Freedom Riders.
Freedom Riders.
Yeah.
Okay.
Come on, Kat.
You have a favorite movie. We all have a favorite movie. We all have a favorite story. And if we ask Kat, she could probably say why she liked it. Because it made her feel a certain way, because there's characters, there's a great villain, there's a great hero. All narratives have the same elements to them. And that's all that the Bible is with narrative. It's just stories. Now, almost half of the Bible, 40%, is narrative. So we really got to know how to read narrative. We're going to talk in specific about Old Testament narrative, Old Testament stories. Stories are a beautiful thing. In fact, it's funny, when I preach quite often, I'm the lead evangelist there in Charlottesville. And whenever I start to get into something kind of technical about a scripture, despite how provocative it is, sometimes heads go down. But if I say, yesterday I was at the store, heads pop up. What happened at the store? Tell me, it's crucial to my development. But if I say, what the word means in Greek, people go, what's he talking about? I'm out of here, baby. We like stories. As much as we may not believe it, we do. We love stories. We love Marvel. We love Star Wars. We love romantic comedies. We love to tell what happened. What happened to you? Oh, it was the craziest thing today. I was at the pharmacy. We love to tell stories, right? Stories are a very powerful thing. And so the Bible, God loves us so much, He decided to reach out to us in every literary genre possible. So we have some great stories. The other benefit of stories is they're easily memorable. Stories are easily remembered. So the Bible for a long time was not transmitted in a written way, but they were transmitted orally. You would you could sit your kids down and tell them the story of the Exodus. Then they would sit their kids down and tell them the same story of the Exodus. And so stories are very important for that way. We still do the same thing to this day. Old Testament narrative is important because it is your spiritual history. If you're a Christian or want to become a Christian, the Old Testament is your spiritual history. Now, it doesn't mean it's your story. It's God's story. But it's God's story as it becomes your story as He writes you into it. It begins as the story of the world, the story of God loving His people, and we enter into that story along the way. But it's a very important thing to still know the Old Testament. It is, in fact, our history. Some hazards in Old Testament narrative. It is not allegorical. Allegory means, you guys read Animal Farm, or there's certain allegories out there where everything represents something. Like the blades of grass are the populations, and as the elephants, the nations fight, they stomp on the people. The grass is the people, and they suffer. That's allegory. Old Testament narrative is not allegory. They're stories. Joseph's, ring that he gets from his dad is not meant to signify purity or something. You know what I mean? Like, that's not what it's supposed to be. It's not explicitly moralistic. We do this a lot. We go, I want to teach on parenting, so I'm going to go to Jacob and Esau. Now, that story is not about parenting. But we can learn parenting from these stories, but it's not about parenting. We can't make it about what we want it to be about. These stories are not meant to teach morals. They're meant to do something else. Misappropriation is a really big one. That basically means you just take something in the Old Testament and you make it mean what you want it to mean in the here and now. We really like David and Goliath because it's like, dude, slay your Goliath, right? Go get that. Go get that A. Slay your Goliath. Go evangelize. Slay your Goliath. Go do that thing. David and Goliath is not about that, so we just got to be careful about misappropriation. I don't want to make people feel guilty about using those things. Those things, as long as you remember the main point of the story, the reason for the story, it's just a slippery slope if we start transplanting those stories into our life. Is all we need to be aware of. But it's a big thing that we can do quite a bit. And just to remember, no biblical narrative was written specifically about you. That's an important one to remember. These biblical narratives were written about other people and other cultures and other times. And we got to learn what God's trying to say to them. Just like if we all got off a plane right now in Paris, we would need to learn the geography. We need to learn, like my wife and I did, that there's 2 separate metros. One to the tickets at the airport don't work in the city metro. You got to know that, and if you don't know it, you're gonna pay the price. You also got to learn that different tourist spots are pretty expensive at different times. You got to learn the French language because the French will not speak English to you because they're French. And so you got to know these things, right, about France. If you go to a different place, you've got to learn the culture. It's natural. Same with Old Testament narrative. Old Testament narrative is best seen within the meta-narrative, within the whole narrative of the Bible. I'm going to use some pretty fancy Keynote animation to walk you through this. So some oohs and ahs are inevitable. But basically the meta-narrative, the story of God in the Bible, that's Yahweh. God Yahweh creating man and woman in his own image.
Wow.
He creates man and woman in his own image to be his image bearers for the earth, to be the gardeners, the cultivators, his representatives on this earth. However, there's an antagonist, there's an enemy, and that's the serpent there, that's Satan. Satan got God's people to want to bear his image instead of God's image. They began to choose to be self-focused and selfish instead of selfless. Therefore, God gave us Jesus to be crucified in an effort to redeem mankind back to him through reconciliation.
Wow.
That's what the Bible's about. There's an enemy, there's a villain, there's a hero, and there's the people like us in the middle who are trying to either choose the enemy or we choose the hero. It is important to remember that God is the hero of every Old Testament story. David is not the hero of the David and Goliath story. God is. Ruth is not the hero of the book of Ruth. Esther is not the hero of the book of Esther. Samuel is not you get the point, right? God is always the hero. When we make the people the hero, we do something very dangerous. It's called moralizing. We take a guy like Will, and we say, man, I just wish that Will worked harder. Look at this passage, Will. Look how hard David worked. He worked hard. You should work hard. That's how we do it, right? Just moralizing. I'm just trying to change his behavior with the scripture. There's no God, there's no Jesus, there's no grace, there's no redemption. So we've got to be careful with moralizing things. God's always the hero. I want to touch base on a very important rhetorical device in Hebrew. Has anyone ever heard of this? It's called inclusio, or chiastic structure, or ring composition. Every Old Testament story is basically in this format. If I tell you a story, it's pretty much going to be the same. Western movie telling. Think about screenwriting. Think about, I'm trying to think of a movie that it's been out 20 years, so maybe I'll ruin it for someone. Who's seen The Sixth Sense?
No.
Yes.
Okay, it's too late. I'm sorry. You've had your chance. So in the beginning of The Sixth Sense, there's the tension, the hook. They grab you with this powerful scene. Then the rest of the movie is tension building, 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 building toward no apparent resolution. Then there's the big hook. I see dead people. It's are you kidding? That's what happened? It all makes sense. It's the climax. There's the twist. There's the boom. There's the final action sequence. And then you feel, wow. You feel relief because the plot has been resolved. Movies that are bad don't have good plot resolution, don't have good plots, don't have good characters. But a good movie has all of those things. I decided not to actually ruin the movie for you, so you can still watch it. But in The Sixth Sense, you go, oh, that beginning makes sense, the movie makes sense, it all comes together in this beautiful way, and it's easy to remember. I don't have to ever watch The Sixth Sense again. I think I've only seen it maybe twice. But I could walk you through exactly what the plot is, who the characters are. It's because it's stuck with me. And a good story, a good sermon should do that. So, Hebrew narrative is balanced. The first thing in the story equals the last thing in the story. The second thing mentioned in the story is the same as the second to last thing mentioned in the story. The third thing mentioned, you get it. The climax in a Hebrew narrative is not at the end, like it is in our movies. The climax in a Hebrew narrative is in the middle. The middle is always the climax, for the most part, if it's ring composition, chiastic structure, or inclusio. A good way to remember this is, do you guys remember, Jesus tells lots of stories in ring composition, but when Jesus is at the Pharisee's house with the sinful woman, and she wets his feet with her tears, and she brings the alabaster jar of perfume, and in the story, you have Simon being a jerk, and at the end, you have the resolution of why Simon's being a jerk. And then in the middle, you have this random parable Jesus tells about two men who owed money to a certain money lender. The point of that whole narrative for Luke is that parable. That's the twist. That's the moment. Who was more grateful, Simon? The one who owed more money. Right. That is the point of that narrative. That whole section is built around that sentence. The one who owed more money. So Jesus uses it quite a bit. So if you're unsure of a story, usually it's in the middle. An example of this also is the Garden of Eden. The first thing mentioned, I just wanted to show this quickly to you. We won't be able to look at it in detail, but God's the sole actor, right, in the beginning of the Garden of Eden. The last thing mentioned is God is the sole actor, and man is present but passive. Man's passive. 2 and 6 equal each other. 3 and 5 equal each other. 4 is the great climax, the great moment. It's man and woman alone in the garden. Let's see what they'll do. And they choose the image of Satan, not the image of God. So most stories are in this chiastic structure. I wanted to mention that just because it is worth noting, because we're so unused to it. Any questions on chiastic structure? You're going to see that a lot. If you read anything that says, this was ring composition, you might go, what? But now you know that's what they mean. This was inclusio. Oh, that's what they mean. Yes?
Can we get your notes?
Sure. Sorry, I went back. I got to do this all again. Oh, it's just going to help you remember, though. The reason I have the candlestick is sometimes it's called menorah composition. The menorah connects all of them. This is a menorah. With fireworks. It's a menorah with fireworks.
Wow.
Whoa! It was worth it. True, that 30 seconds you put into that was really paid off. Because you're going to remember inclusio for the rest of your life. Ruth will save for later. Any questions on Old Testament narrative? That was quick, but we did it. Old Testament narrative, good?
Yeah. Just in general, just general questions about the whole thing.
Yeah.
Are you going to get in, I guess you said you're doing like a flyover, right? So
You can go ahead and ask, it's fine.
well, just, I find this genre to be the hardest to exegete, just because it's so big and like, how would you go about breaking it up piece by piece, practically speaking?
Yeah.
Or is that not the question asked around, because we're just doing a flyover?
It's a good question. Most of the Old Testament that's narrative is Genesis. Genesis is all narrative. It's 50 chapters of narrative. The Old Testament books, there's some narrative in Exodus, but there's a lot of law in Exodus. There's some narrative in the prophets, a little bit. There's some in Daniel. There's a lot in Samuel. Your big narrative books are Samuel, Kings, and Genesis. And the best thing to remember, I think, with stories is that actually the entire book of Samuel, so 1st and 2nd Samuel are one work. The first thing said in 1 Samuel 1 matches the last thing said in 2 Samuel 22. The whole book of Samuel is chiastic structure, with the point, the middle being King David being anointed king. So it'll help you to know that.
Should we read that in mind, like as we read, or should consultants look as we break down passage to passage in the letters, right? So should we come at the end of this, because then we'll make the bigger connections, and then kind of break it up, or should we try to take it chapter, passage by chapter still and all that?
So in epistles, Gordon Fee and Stewart mentioned this in their book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. In epistles, you're trying to think paragraphs. What's the paragraph saying? In Old Testament, you're thinking narrative. So when the story ends, it's good to note what's that story about. But stories also have meaning within the stories they're next to. Genesis is a really good way of doing that. You read about Noah and the flood, and then all of a sudden you have Noah and this weird naked story where he's found naked by his sons. And then you have the Tower of Babel. It's going to be hard. I think you have to think why, but at the end of the day, it's a really good Bible dictionary.
Right.
So for Genesis, we're doing Genesis in Charlottesville. I think I've read 3 different books on Genesis, and I'm still just starting to kind of get the sense of it.
So
a lot of extra reading.
Extra reading.
Yeah, a lot of extra reading will help you on that. But it pays off so well. When I really know what Genesis is doing, it's beautiful. When you don't, it's difficult. So it's just that extra work of studying.
Okay.
But Old Testament will be that way. Yeah.
With larger books, especially larger books in the Old Testament, and you're fighting to exegete the text, will you sit down and read, let's say you're going to go through the book of Isaiah. Will you read the book of Isaiah from chapter 1 to chapter 66? And if so, how? When I do it, I completely lose focus.
So prophecy is, we'll talk about prophecy later. Isaiah's prophecy, and there's a little bit of narrative in there. Narrative to me is easier to read, it's stories. Prophecy's tough, because it's like, it's speaking in a language that we're not quite getting. And prophecy is oracles, and the oracles will be next to each other, but you'll have a judgment oracle next to a marriage oracle, next to a agricultural oracle, and you're going, is this the same place? Are we still in Babylon? Are we in Israel? So we'll talk more about prophecy a bit later. But no, I wouldn't read the whole, no, in prophecy you think oracles. You're thinking sections. As best you can, you want to read as much as you can, because you do want to get context, and it will help you to kind of know those things. But yeah, you want to read as much as you can with those. With narrative, it ends up being a really good Bible dictionary and a really good commentary. There are 2 commentaries I will mention that I hang my hat on. They're expensive, but wait till Christmas. I bought both at Christmas for half off. So the World Biblical Commentary is one of the best in the world. And it's a WBC. It's $1,000. But it's the most exhaustive thing you'll ever find. You may never need another book. But at Christmas, it's like $500. So, yeah.
500. That's not bad.
Come on, Ron.
And I know it sounds like a lot, but in the past, what I've done is I did this in college. I said, Mom and Dad, instead of a Christmas gift, can I have money I'm saving up for the WBC? I did that for a couple of years, and I bought the WBC, and I've used it 100 times or more. And I'm only 30. I'm going to use that thing for forever. If the WBC is very technical, which means it's very much into the language. If you want something more pastoral, basically something that's a little bit more here and now and a bit more readable, Gordon Fee, the guy who wrote How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, has his own commentary, which is outstanding, and it's cheaper, $800 instead of $1,000. But I use both, 1, 2, and I mean, it gives you everything. These guys do the legwork. They give you everything you need, and that's my 1-2 punch with all those things. So it's something good to keep it in mind. The Fee is the New International Commentary of the New Testament, NICNT. Fee is where I would start if you're not good with the languages. NICNT. And the NICOT is his buddy, mostly Hubbard, worked on that one, but they work together. Fee does the New Testament, Hubbard the Old. So for Genesis, I will read probably 3 hours of the WBC, then I'll read 3 hours of the NICOT, and then I also have a book I bought by Douglas Jacoby on Genesis, and then that's after I've done all my exegesis. Now, this is my full-time job, so don't get overwhelmed if you, I go to work and stuff. If you are coming home from Starbucks at 6 p.m., that's why I gave you the free resources. Don't get overwhelmed, but I will say that over time, building an incredible library, it's just, you can't beat it. And then people ask you the same questions they'll ask for the next 100 years. Just have it. Hey, I've actually done research. Here you go. Let me send it to you. So it's a very valuable thing. But Old Testament, just, yeah, extra reading is what I mean by that. But boy, oh boy, do I love the Old. If you can get into the Old Testament and sense it, it brings this full breadth. Jesus was operating from the Old Testament. Paul was operating from it. It's definitely worth it. Now, here's another issue. We've crossed the swamp. Now we're going into some, I don't know, rocky terrain, and we don't want to roll our ankle in the book of Acts. Dun, dun, dun. Acts, okay. Do you read the book of Acts like you read the book of Genesis? Why not? They're both narrative. What's the difference? Yeah.
Acts is more about history rather than story alone. Genesis.
Are the Genesis stories not history?
Well, that's a good question.
Thank you.
I don't know. There's debate about that and what kind of history is it? But Acts is more. It is more history of places and characters that were known. Like it's a different type of history being done.
So you feel like the Genesis stories maybe are more like mythological fantasies.
No, but I think they have a lot more of those thrown in rather than Acts. Acts doesn't have that kind of stuff.
Acts has people being raised from the dead. Is that easier to believe than a flood?
No, but I think it's easier interpreted than all the background reading.
You're right. It's closer to our culture. Yes,
Right.
for sure.
Right.
Totally. It's a little bit closer to what we understand. Anybody else?
I was going to say that Genesis points to the fall of man, but Acts is about the beginning of man.
True. There's something we do, and it's a good point. We are closer culturally. But I do think narratives in the Bible, I would encourage you, Old Testament narrative is history. The author of Genesis he's not trying to say something fake. Now, he's using idioms, he's using comedy, he's using irony to tell a story like any good storyteller would. Like you watch a Marvel movie, you're laughing the whole time. Just because a Marvel movie that uses humor doesn't mean it's not trying to still make it a good movie. So, Old Testament narrative is still history. It looks different. New Testament narrative is history as well, but there's something you're doing when you're reading Acts that you're not doing when you're reading Genesis. When you read Acts, you know what you're doing? You're going, this is the model for church. You're going, Acts 2, they were together in everything, we need to be together in everything. They broke bread together, we need to break bread together. You're not doing that in Genesis. You're not going, wow, look at what's going on with Jacob and Leah, Jacob and Rachel. You know what? We need to do that now. You're not. You're saying that was for them. It's not for us. Why do we do it? This is the greatest hurdle with the book of Acts. What is for us and what is not for us? And you do it. You read a passage in Acts that says that they spoke in tongues, and then the next verse it says they all got baptized. And you go, baptism, that's us. Tongues, nope. But why? What's the reason for it? So Acts is an incredibly important book. One of the biggest problems in church today is whether a church looks at Acts as a paradigmatic, basically a model or not. Should we try to be like the church in Acts? Is that why it was written? Was Luke's intent to give us the model of the perfect church? Or was his intent something else? These are all very important things to remember in the book of Acts, because it can be very tricky if we just go, we need to do everything they did. We need to just do everything they did.